Well, I think people are still in shock. I mean, they're in a state of suspended unknowing because they don't know what's true, they don't know where to turn, and yet a lot of them are really clinging to life here.
Well, at birth, Mom and Papa called a little boy Ned, raised him on the banks of a riverbed, a houseboat tied to a big tall tree. Home for my mama and my papa and me. The clock strikes 3, Papa jumps to his feet. Already mama's cooking Papa something to eat. At 1:30, Papa, he's ready to go. He jumps in his pirogue going down the bayou. Got the fishing line, cross the Louisiana River. Gotta catch a big fish for us to eat. Setting traps in the swamp, catching anything he can. Gotta make a living, he's a Louisiana man. Gotta make a living, he's a Louisiana man. Muskrat high, hanging by the dozen. Even got a lady making muskrat cousin. Got 'em out drying in the hot, hot sun. Tomorrow Papa's gonna turn 'em into money.
Hurricanes Katrina and Rita struck one of the most densely industrialized and polluted regions of the U.S. when they battered the Louisiana and East Texas Gulf Coast. The wide path of these twin storms included 31 hazardous waste sites and 466 facilities that manufacture and process potentially dangerous chemicals. U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Stephen L. Johnson described the aftermath of these storms as the largest natural disaster the EPA and the nation has ever faced. He went on to state, "We are concerned about the water, we are concerned about the land, and we are also concerned about the air." Floodwater samples showed evidence of benzene, ethylbenzene, chloroacetic acid, elevated levels of lead, arsenic, and other metal residues, hexavalent chromium, medical waste, and lots of spilled crude oil, creating slicks and sheens throughout the intercoastal waterway system. Now that the floods have receded, where did all the hazardous chemicals go? What's in that caked and desiccated toxic gumbo, coating vast swatches of Jefferson, St. Bernard, and Orleans parishes? Parts of coastal parishes, like Jefferson, Plaquemines, and St. Bernard, spent 2 weeks or more underwater after Katrina. Sabine Pass, Port Arthur, Orange, and Beaumont, Texas, were battered by wind on the west side of Hurricane Rita. Cameron, Vermilion, Calcasieu Parish, and the city of Lake Charles were also decimated by the surge and wind from the eye of that storm. Estimates say 15% of South Plaquemines Parish may be permanently underwater. The 18,273-acre Breton National Wildlife Refuge is down to 1/2 its size. Acres and acres of habitat for endangered sea turtles and miles of coastal dune habitat may have been irrevocably destroyed. In New Orleans, a city of 180,000 housing units, 110,000 sustained some flood damage. Of this number, FEMA estimates 50% will be demolished. Another 30% will need extensive renovation. The The Agriculture Street Superfund site in New Orleans, containing contaminants such as lead, arsenic, and carcinogenic PAHs, was covered with a thin layer of topsoil and new soil when it was submerged by the storm for weeks. The 9th Ward, recently freed of its floodwaters, shows no signs of government-sponsored reclamation activity. In St. Bernard Parish, 85% of 26,000 housing units are slated for demolition. The city of Chalmette, drained after 4 weeks of its floodwaters, is almost totally ruined, totally empty, desolate, beyond belief. The Murphy oil spill dumped 1 million plus gallons of Arabian medium crude oil into the refinery complex and the fence-lined neighborhoods of Chalmette when storage containers in a company tank farm were lifted off their slab and later crumpled as floodwaters receded. Murphy's most current TRI information shows that massive quantities of benzene, toluene, xylene, naphthalene, ethylbenzene, cyclohexane, 1,2,4-trimethylbenzene, hydrogen fluoride, propylene, ammonia, and ethylene were most probably on site when the facility sustained damage. So, where did those chemicals go? Are the residues harmless, or are they a potential threat to health? And who will sample and monitor their concentrations? Who will interpret the results of this sampling? And how will this information reach the public in a useful form and a timely manner? Who will clean this mess up before redevelopment begins? Will redevelopment actively involve local workers, local craft persons, local dreams and needs? Will this redevelopment happen prematurely before environmental health threats are identified and addressed, just to kickstart the region's dormant economy? Walking into a single-family home in a Chalmette subdivision of so many acres, it's difficult to imagine how this area could be reasonably reclaimed. It smells so indelibly bad. It's caked with mold and thick, murky mud. It's heartbreak on an epic scale. It's a monumental stain on the soul of the land. Folks on the ground, immersed in rescue and recovery operations, have their own take on the storms and their outcomes. These citizens, all deeply involved with community-based environmental organizations and emergency response networks, have offered their opinions on the damage done and the threats posed by Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. They've commented on excessive flaring and dumping of air toxics into their fence-line communities as idle petrochemical facilities are brought back online under relaxed EPA scrutiny. They've advised caution for people coming back. Hazardous waste sites, petrochemical facilities, and local sewage processing may have been breached or leaked into local surface water supplies. The soil may also be contaminated. They've lamented a lack of basic services and health and safety information. They've expressed dismay, disgust, and outrage at the logistical bottlenecks and jurisdictional disputes that stymied rescue efforts and have overly complicated safe re-entry for displaced citizens. They've mourned the Louisiana diaspora and the perhaps irreparable damage to local and regional cultures, to African American neighborhoods like the lower 9th Ward, to the Houma Nation, to Acadiana and the Bayou Cajuns, to the unique cultural mix of Greater New Orleans. They've graciously shared these thoughts and offered ideas for useful regional collaborations with environmental scientists and clinicians. This is a window on the efforts of Katrina and Rita victims to comprehend their needs, roll up their collective sleeves, and get the job of reclamation done right. This is just a small piece of their painful, heroic, and steady ongoing story.
I would say that people are constantly loving and battling the waters. You know, we make our living off the waters, but there's always a tropical storm. There's always somebody flooding. Small communities, large areas. This storm has just been more devastating than most. So since I was a child, you've had areas that flooded and nobody knew about dangers. You have people who live with mold. You know, if you travel down the little bayous, you're going to maybe see a house that's got several water lines, water marks on it. And I think that that's just, you know, because nobody ever came to their aid. People didn't even ask. They just thought, oh, this is part of their lot. I make my living off the water. I live near the water, and so I clean up after every disaster. I go on and I rebuild.
Basically, a bunch of marsh got ripped out of the Plaquemine and St. Bernard, where Katrina hit. You know, just to the east of Plaquemine and south of St. Bernard. I mean, there's a lot of open water, but just over here.
Just in this area, 30 square miles.
In South Louisiana, but most of it, most in a very small area, southeast Louisiana, probably about 30 square miles ripped out. And but in our area, we have so much open water now. But I mean, you know, when I was a kid, it was almost all solid marsh. So we have a lot of open water to begin with, and then you see the mounds of marsh grass that we see on the road stacked up. Well, that was on the ground. That was marsh that now is open water.
Yeah.
So that's all over the place. So every time you see that, you know, that's lost marsh, that's open water. That's going to stay open water basically, unless we have some major restoration projects.
Well, David, the house is on the island of total. They're completely total. I just got back from there. I lived there all my life. And my brother, I still got brothers and sisters that live there. You don't want to live in those. I mean, it's total. It's completely total. It smells bad over the umbrella, I mean, the wind. And now I can only barely walk 30 feet on a dry ground.
You lost 270 feet.
Yes.
Wow.
You know, I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, that is.
It's the politicians knew it was disappearing. They knew it was disappearing. Now they're asking the people of Lafourche and Terrebonne, call your congressman, call your representative, call Washington. They don't want to do their job. They should have done their job 40 years ago. They knew it was disappearing. I saw it disappearing, and I'm sure they knew it was disappearing. They live right there. They moved out of their house. They had one that lived in Parish, representative. He moved out of his house to build one closer to home. But he left his people in the water.
You know, on the lower end, it's extensive water damage.
That's Plaquemines Parish?
Yeah, Plaquemines Parish. Everything inside the levee stayed underwater for a couple weeks. And so, like my trailer was completely submerged. So, you know, it's moved, and then all the insulation, everything is falling out the ceiling. You know, it's unusable. I was able to salvage a few whatnots for my wife and that kind of thing. But the worst of the damage seems to be up around Port Sullivan, Buras, and Empire area, where the Iowa came ashore. So, I mean, there are boats everywhere, boats on the levees. I saw a 2-ton shrimp truck hanging from a tree. There's 2-story houses in the middle, and trailers in the middle of 4 lanes still. The 4 lanes are passable. In a couple places you got to go around, like in Empire, through the old bridge to get by. Everything's displaced. The Pogie plant down there is destroyed. There's fish oil residue all over. It's almost indescribable.
What about the orange trees? That was a huge industry for all the United States. Yeah. Lots of oranges.
Every orange tree is dead. And even down towards the lower part of Buras Triumph, going into Venice, the watermarks in the orange trees are up near the top of the tree, so they stayed submerged for a long time. They're all brown, they're all dead. Salt water kills them, and that was the majority of what was in there. So I think the orange industry is about dead down there.
So Michael, what are you going to do?
I'm going to stay here for at least a year through the school season. We're raising my grandkids, so we'll put them in school here in Ray Center. We're going to stay here at least through the school year. If they allow us to go back to Boothville sometime in the future, we're going to go back. We want to go back. But it's a matter of they've got extensive levee damage to repair before they let people move back down there again. The entire infrastructure is destroyed. So I'm looking optimistically at a year.
This is Ken Ford's office, the St. Bernard Citizens for Environmental Quality. He's the president of the group, and he had this office. It was incredible. I mean, he had certainly a lot, his computers and a lot of electronic equipment, but he had files that went on for days, documenting all of the environmental work here for the last 30 years. So that was all flooded. Just, of course, very sad.
New Orleans. The other areas, the people who live on the waterways, the water bodies, along the coast, they're going to rebuild. There was all this talk in Cameron, everything's been destroyed, and people say, well, it's been 30 years since Audrey, we made it 30 years, we'll build another house, and if it lasts 30 years, that's fine. So that's the culture, is people are going to rebuild. One of the positive things that we must do is ensure that that rebuilding is done in the appropriate way. In New Orleans, they'll rebuild, the people will move back in. It may not be quite the same, but people will continue to move in and work there. And it's very important to have some criteria so that you try and avoid a lot of problems. And right now is not the time to be establishing rules and regs and criteria because no one wants to hear it. They want to be able to just move back in, get the electricity turned back on, get the natural gas turned back on, and live happily ever after.
You're quite right. That's what everyone's saying. Yeah.
Now, what has happened since the hurricane? Two things that we might want to talk about. One is the fact that where these areas were flooded, toxic pollution also occurred. There was an out-and-out major oil spill in, I think it's St. Bernard Parish, from Murphy Oil. And who is to say that a lot of other chemicals weren't dumped either accidentally or on purpose from any number of the other petrochemical plants along the industrial corridor. New Orleans itself doesn't have much in the way of petrochemical industries, but its suburban areas do. All those areas around New Orleans do. And New Orleans has a lot of very old pollution. It had 4 incinerators that operated for many, many years, and there was one, as I understand it, in each sector of New Orleans. So that over many years, they spewed out lead, mainly, mercury, arsenic, other heavy metals. Most of that has gotten covered up by dirt. What did Katrina do? Washed it up.
Because of the canals cut through the marshland, saltwater intrusion, and everything else that's happening to our planet, we're having a loss of our seafood. And we have to know that we're in an estuary. The estuary is the birthplace of all of the food chain, all the seafood. And so while people are working, they're never pushing and telling people what's going on here. More people know about the Florida Everglades, which is a relatively small amount of land lost every year, than the tremendous amount of land loss that we're encountering here in Louisiana every day. It's tremendous. It's unbelievable. And so along with the land loss comes a loss of the natural environment, comes a loss of the animals, comes a loss of a way of life, and people in other parts of the United States don't even realize how much is produced in Louisiana that will affect them here, there, and the other. Whether it's the oil production, in the stockings that a woman wears every day, or the lipstick she puts on her face, or whatever, the seafood that they're having in Maryland, the Maryland crab cakes. Usually the crabs come from here. Anytime you're eating good shrimp, it's coming from Louisiana. And so until people realize the impact it has on them, They're not interested in what's happening in Louisiana.
In Erath, Louisiana, the Henry Hub, where 5 major gas pipelines get together, that's where the price of gas is set every day. And Erath was affected by Katrina. A little bit closer to it, we could have had another major issue with gas, but St. Bernard Parish, there's a gas plant that's about 9 million cubic feet a day that it produces that's out of commission. 3 refineries in St. Bernard out of commission. And this winter, people are going to feel it. Remember, 4 storms hit Florida. Okay. People in Iowa didn't affect them. All right. 2 storms hit Louisiana. People in Iowa are affected.
How is the state of Louisiana or the federal government or whoever is going to be responsible for that going to dispose of all this residue?
That's a big controversy. They're looking at permitting or reopening with a permit somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 landfills in the state of Louisiana. They permitted the Gentilly landfill, which was closed, which was a landfill that didn't originally have a liner or leachate system to dispose of some of the debris. One of the issues is that a lot of the wood in the greater New Orleans area has Formosa termites. So you don't want to start hauling any wood waste outside the immediate area because you have the potential of spreading Formosa termites into the communities that you haul it to deposit in construction and demolition debris landfills. They're talking about using some of those air curtain destructor burners, which they dig a hole in the ground, put the incinerator type unit with an air blower so that everything is blown down into the pit. And it's supposed to control the dust and smoke emissions, which it doesn't. But it's better than open burning. So there's a whole host of approaches. All of these approaches are appropriate for part of the waste stream. But if you took any notice of what was piled up at the curb, everything's mixed in there. And if you start seeing the trucks come by to dispose of it, they're collecting it all and dumping it in one truck and taking it. So it's really a mixed waste, and not any of these approaches are specific for the mixed waste. They're all like for the demolition debris, for the tree limbs, and then for the household materials, the nutritious waste that everybody's been putting out. And then they're supposed to separately take the white goods, the refrigerator, the washer, the dryer, and separately from that they're supposed to be taking the automobiles.
And so obviously a school is a place of concern. And so one of the samples that we took was right at the foot of this slide. And so this is exactly what I did. I had these gloves on. The date was September the 19th. And those were the first samples that we took. On that day, I was here with the Fords. Ken Ford is the president of the St. Bernard Citizens for Environmental Quality. So on that day I was here with them, and we took we took 4 samples. We took one right here at the base of the slide. We took one over there by the entrance to the cafeteria. Took one in his front yard, and then one at the church. And again, those were all areas that the community said they'd like to test in. It's important to do any of this testing in concert with them. And so we filled these 2 jars with soil. And it's a pretty straightforward process. This is a stainless steel shovel, and you can either clean it off with alcohol between each use, or you can use a new one for every sample. And so that's what I did. I just used a new one for every sample because I didn't want to have any problems with contamination.
People who are relocated are not going to be able to come back. They're not going to be economically able to come back. Or like, for instance, some of the folks at Agriculture Street Landfill, I'm sure Wilma talked about it. She saw them coming back. They got a few things, and they said, I'm never coming back again. I mean, for some people, it's like the guy on Grand Isle. They just had enough. You know, they've been battling toxic pollution. Agriculture Street Landfill also had Hurricane Betsy's debris, which was the kicker. So, and then they built on top of that. And so, for some people, I don't believe they'll come back. And so it's really sort of like a blank slate.
And so this is the soil here. What we found in those samples is we found arsenic and heavy metals in the samples. Obviously that's a big concern, because if a kid comes down a slide, they fall into this dirt, they get it on their hands, you know, whatever, they wrestle with their friends, and then the concern is they get the dirt on their hands and then they stick their hands in their mouth. We took those samples on the 19th of September, and I actually took more samples just before Thanksgiving, and we should get the results soon. But certainly, you know, there are heavy metals in this soil. There are heavy metals and there are diesel compounds. One of the things that I found really surprising was that the Department of Environmental Quality has been saying, oh, it's not a concern because all that stuff was in the soil before Katrina.
I mean, our concerns is that there will be no way to track, you know, health, what's going to happen to these people. I feel from what I've witnessed and heard and experienced in the last 20 years that people are going to have a tremendous amount of health problems, and everybody is so dispersed. It's biblical. I mean, it's like people are, you know, everywhere, literally all over the country, right? And families are still even separated. Now, these used to happen all the time, several times a day, but you're lucky. It was really like being in a war zone for quite a while. And, but anyway, I'm concerned about that, you know, is how people are going to get health care, how they're going to be taken care of. You know, for us, our immediate needs has been about this reentry kits and things like that, and getting supplies.
Talking about those too, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
These recovery kits you're talking about, I saw some of them up in Mary Lee Orr's lean office.
Correct.
And I was wondering, do you have one here?
No, she has.
She has them all. Could you describe what's in the kit?
Tyvek suit, gloves and booties, and tape in order to fully secure those things. A respirator or a dust mask, depending on what areas you're going in.
What is there a number designation on that mask?
There's a specific one for mold, and I don't have it right at hand, but it's the one that they tell you if you're going to go in and be dealing with the mold.
Okay.
Use that one, and that's keeping the dust from the sediment out, and then protecting you from the mold are critical as far as the respirator. And then it has the cleaning supplies that you would need. It has first aid kit. It has the hand wash items that you don't need water. So it has everything that you can physically go into this home, clean it up, or go in there and retrieve some of your personal items, clean them up, and it has a bag for disposal so that you put all the residue in that and properly dispose of it.
Well, I think people need to be able to have health clinics and to be able to be monitored and treated for, you know, for instance, back to the minister, and that this has to do with the public health question. He's not an environmentalist, but he said when he was going among the people laid out, because he was not in the triage area, but in the area where they were transported by the plane, he said he could look and tell by their body who'd been in the water and who hadn't, because already people were developing this rash that you're hearing about, and the sores and the blisters and things like that. So there's going to be a tremendous burden for people and for health community professionals to respond to the fact, and I think it's East Jefferson Hospital, where they're seeing these infections that don't respond to traditional treatment. You know, there's gastrointestinal problems. There's lots and lots of physical manifestations already. And one of our helpers, who's a lawyer from New Orleans, he was rescuing animals, fell in the water. He spent 6 hours in the emergency room really sick, and they called it Katrina's revenge. But I'm not really certain, I don't want to worry him, but I'm not really certain down the line what that exposure is going to cost him, really.
You know, this is a city that's very old, even though a lot of things were not up to code. As I mentioned before, when I moved to New Orleans 12 years ago, almost no one would live inside New Orleans. They all lived in the suburbs because they were scared to live inside the city. 25% of all the housing was considered blighted, meaning condemned, unlivable. You've got a lot of lead paint that historically has been here, even though they've said when you repaint, you have to remove all the paint and go over it with non-lead. Well, I can guarantee there's a lot of lead in the city, and that's now gone into the soil. So you've got the lead issue. You also have the asbestos issue. Asbestos isn't talked about a whole lot anymore, but again, when you're not up to code, and you're several decades behind in your infrastructure, in your buildings, it's going to have an impact. These are things that people need to come down and test and find out where we are with those.
There's legislation that was passed that states that anything that is a product of the exploration, production, oil field, petroleum products is by definition non-hazardous, regardless of how hazardous it is.
No, I guess I'm not.
Now it's not hazardous.
This is a state lead.
No, this is federal.
This is federal.
And I've got an EPA booklet that explains this, and it's really cute reading it because they're saying this is non-hazardous, hazardous material. Okay.
I was going to say, because benzene is a carcinogen. It's
right.
proven.
It's bad all the way around.
Right.
And so, so this is considered a NOW site, non-hazardous oil field waste site.
Oh, because it's oil field.
So that's how it qualifies for handling this material. When the state did monitoring, I took every monitoring point that I could and I put it in a relational database and crunch numbers and got Wilma to check my numbers out because just wanted to make sure somebody else that knew what was going on did it. And we had benzene levels that were totally unacceptable in there. And we had a home that was within 300 feet of the worst pits. Alabama, there was a pit that they were closing in Alabama, non-hazardous oil field.
Is that in Anniston?
It was in Escambia.
Uh-huh.
And they brought this material, this is when this all hit the fan, really,
Mm-hmm.
they brought this material to this site and unloaded it at the site in the pits that were closest. For some reason, they unloaded it in the pits that were closest to the community.
Mm-hmm.
There's a facility near one of our communities in Grand Bois, an open pit disposal facility for oil field waste.
That's the U.S. Liquid?
Yes. And as far as environmental problems and health problems directly linked to it, I think that's our worst case scenario. The place that needs the most immediate attention as far as environmental concerns and hasn't gotten it.
Where are we? We're at the U.S. Liquids facility, and we're standing by the stockpile. The stockpile is all the material that comes into the pits that have been, according to the facility, ready to be reused for any type of need. You could use this, they say, to fill in your front yard if needed, or anything else that you would use soil for.
As the sludge dries, it becomes dust, and all the responders and the people running up and down the roads are dispersing it into the air. DEQ and EPA together are monitoring particulates, but they're not monitoring what's contained in those particulates. And what's contained in those particulates is the same substances we've analyzed in the sludge. So you're having a constant increase in particulates contaminated with toxic emissions as the sludge starts to dry and as the people start returning home and stirring it up. I had a report from someone I talked to this morning who went to New Orleans over the weekend to check a piece of their property, and they said the dust is just unbelievable and it's being dispersed into the air.
Get us good. And they're just getting all splattered with it too. That's the
What the hell is that? That's spray?
What about the toxic chemicals? The dogs that I have a couple of dogs that came from Slidell, the Slidell area. They received storm surge from Lake Pontchartrain. And Lake Pontchartrain is a pretty putrid lake. Even though they've been working hard to try to clean it up, there are chemicals there, plus the fact over in Slidell there was at least one Superfund site, and I think there was another site that was under consideration. So how much this stuff got stirred up and spread around the Slidell area in that storm surge, I don't know.
Then when they start these various types of open burning or air curtain destructor burning, all of that's going to add to the toxic emissions. And it's going to be real difficult for the agencies to say, okay, in order to operate this landfill, you have to have continuous monitoring of toxic air emissions and particulate matter. They're not going to put those kind of restrictions. So I see the quality of the air going downhill. And in Louisiana, normally the first week of November is where the weather sits down. By that I mean it's very calm, very still, no wind. We start getting the fog, and everything that would be dispersed or mixed into the air just sits down very near the ground. And this is going to be the time when all the burning is going to start to occur, and we're going to have a real air pollution problem that's going to stick around for a long, long time.
I'm not really certain what Louisiana is going to be like. I think that the people that were moved out of Houston to Nebraska and Arkansas and all that, I mean, how are they going to get back? I mean, churches, I understand, like in other areas, like in San Antonio, they're finding housing and permanent jobs for these people. You can understand that some of them don't have any resources. There were 186,000 people who didn't have cars in the city of New Orleans as of like 2003 or whatever the latest census was. So those people couldn't even leave if they'd wanted to, that we feel probably, right? Yeah. So a lot of the poor are relocated, and they're not going to be able to fly back and see their property and things like that. And then what are they going to find? I mean, the pictures that I saw today, the stories that we hear and the things that we've seen, I mean, some places, for me, wouldn't be habitable at all. So what are you going to do about that?
It is African Americans that you see in overwhelming numbers in shelters in Houston, in Georgia, in Chicago, in Tennessee. It was African Americans that have been displaced in huge numbers. Are these people ever going to be able to return to New Orleans? Do they have the financial resources to rebuild their homes? Is New Orleans going to rebuild low-income homes? Some of those houses were such classic houses, shotgun houses, but they were so artistic, and people lived in them, and people had fixed them up, and people were very proud of their homes, and in fact they were very, very attractive houses. Is New Orleans going to rebuild these shotgun houses for low-income people to come back to? Or are they going to make something fancy for yuppies?
Every organization, whether they're environmental or environmental justice, social justice, whatever the groups are, particularly if they're New Orleans based or located, or Baton Rouge or wherever they are on the Gulf Coast, have their operations have been completely disrupted over the last month, and will continue to be disrupted for the foreseeable future, because they're having to deal with issues other than the ones they had decided they were going to work on, or previously decided. And most of these groups are helping family, friends, or maybe organizational members who have been displaced, are dislocated. They're helping them find a new place to live, or helping them find new jobs while their offices are closed. And so it's a major disruption. And for small groups, like Louisiana Environmental Action Network just has a handful of staffers, they were totally consumed with helping people in the storm-hit areas with getting water and food and essential items like diapers and water. That in some of the places they went into in North Shore of Lake Pontchartrain, they were the first group to bring in assistance, and they're not set up to do that kind of work. So it's been a major disruption of environmental and social justice groups.
This was something we had to address as the tribal leaders and as Home of People, is the need to make sure that our tribal members can be safe from harm's way. And these two storms just kind of put that even more to the forefront, that we knew it's something we needed to address. Our communities are all along the bayous of southeast Louisiana. Just when you think you've hit the Gulf of Mexico, you've reached our communities. And so we have been heavily impacted with coastal erosion on a daily basis. And we've probably seen firsthand more than anyone the effects of coastal erosion, because it affects our communities, like I said, on a daily basis. Even with a high tide or a certain wind surge, we'll have water in our yards, and so we know what it's been doing to our communities. Well, Hurricane Katrina and Rita has, as I said, even showed us more how susceptible we are, vulnerable we are to hurricanes and what it can do to our communities, because we no longer have that buffer zone that we once had. We're losing so much land, you know, at such a rapid pace that the Gulf of Mexico is now almost in our backyards, literally. And so what we're having to do is, as a council and as a people, see how we can save our communities, because a lot of them don't want to leave, because they have generation after generation that's lived in our different Homa communities. And so they would not want to leave, but at the same time, it's almost to where they may not have a choice in the immediate future, because there's not going to be anything left for them.
I think everybody is questioning what is going to be the demographics of the state after Hurricane Katrina. Baton Rouge, I think, currently is the largest city in Louisiana. We have a lot of displaced people from New Orleans, and New Orleans has just lost its people, so it's a small city now. It's going to be very, very interesting, and I'm sure there's going to have to be some redistricting, and that could have some very far-reaching repercussions on the ability of African Americans to express their concerns in government. So I think it's a very big concern.
It's affected everyone except probably the really rich, who could afford to fly in their own personal soldiers from Israel and land them in Audubon Park and have them taken out to guard their mansion. Seriously, that happened. A lot of international military were brought in personally by extremely wealthy landowners, especially over here in the Garden District, to literally watch and protect the homes so they didn't get looted like ours did. It's really the middle class, I think, that's completely had their lives flipped upside down. The people that own property, that had been paying their taxes, they worked real hard for what they had. They still have student loans. They still, they were getting on their feet, and everything's gone. They'll never be able to get back on their feet.
I've never worked in a shelter before. I've done other things. This is the first time I worked in a shelter, and I was shocked at the lack of information, organization, infrastructure. There was nothing. I came into this shelter a week and a half after the event, after Katrina. And when I walked in, my first question is, who's in charge? And this is what I asked to the Red Cross. And the nurse pointed me to this gentleman. She says, he's in charge. And I said, are you in charge? Because I wanted to find out what they needed. So he says, oh, I'm not in charge. I'm just a volunteer. And I'm working, with the Red Cross and also the Diocese of Houma Thibodeau, because we're going to have a program called, I want to say, Angel Wings or something, that they'll try to reconnect families. So he said, I would go to the National Guard. So I went to the National Guard. Are you in charge here? They said, no, we're not in charge. This gentleman started the program off, and I don't think he's in charge. I think it is the center administrator, but you need to go ask him. So I go back, and this guy was from the government, Lafourche Parish government. Are you in charge? We started the shelter off, but we're doing limited things now. The people in charge are the people who are the director of this facility, which was a civic center. So I walked into that office. Now, what I'm thinking is, you mean to tell me they have all these agencies here and nobody even knows who's in charge? This is pretty interesting.
That on September 19th, we came and took some samples. And we took those samples with the community members. We had sat down and looked at a map and figured out where were the important places to take samples. I mean, it's a whole nother story, but part of, I think, what's gone wrong post-Katrina is that the community members from the impacted areas have really not been a part of the ongoing assessment of the area. People have come in and taken samples, and you know, a lot of times the people who live there didn't even know a thing about it.
It's just like when you are able to obtain a relocation of a fence line community. It tears the fabric of that community apart because you rarely have the time to develop a subdivision to move them as an entire community. So you have the caregivers living in different places, you have the churches having to relocate, you just have that cultural fabric, and that's what's happened in New Orleans on a much grander scale. I think the ones that subsist without regular jobs, if they provide them with bus transportation, they're going to come back because they're coming back to the familiar. They're coming back where they have each other to depend on. It's the ones who depend on the jobs that are going to go elsewhere, and you're going to lose that whole segment. If they're in Houston, if they're in San Antonio and they are able to find jobs, they're going to stay there. They're going to stay there for some time. Maybe eventually they'll come back, but for a large part of the time they will stay there. And you just lose all that interconnection that makes up the culture.
Well, right now we're in Chalmette down St. Bernard Highway, and what you're going to be looking at here is a site that FEMA has selected to house people. They're going to be housing evacuees, anyone who doesn't have land or doesn't have somewhere to put a trailer. This is where you're going to be living. It's going to be quite an actually big spot, and they'll have several more in the city of Chalmette. If you guys will come this way, you'll see we're going to have trailers set up on each side of the road here, and as of right now, this is supposed to be done on the 28th. Okay. And that's the first I heard of a date where somebody is actually going to have one of these parks set up. Now, this is the third company I worked for FEMA, and it's not going up like it should. This company is doing a damn good job of getting this up and ready and how it's supposed to be. This is going to be okay, and I think it'll be a good place for some people. I really do.
This, you know, I don't even know what to say when I come here, because here we have been fighting this refinery right over there, ExxonMobil, for years now. I mean, Ken Ford's been fighting it for 30 years. So here we've been working with them to get it cleaned up, to stop their emissions, so that people here won't be exposed to all the pollutants that they're putting out. And then what does FEMA do? Increase the population in this area.
As a citizen, you know, would I feel safe here? Probably not. But where else can people go, you know? It's running out of room. The city is becoming less and less populated. New Orleans was a second-class city to start with. We've always been financially in debt, and as it looks now, it's going to stay that way.
When I look at the workers, they're Hispanic, and they're unprotected. They're totally unprotected. They're dressed like you are. They're in a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. And, you know, there's these huge dry vacs going into the hotels, and they're just walking around. And all that residue, when it dries, and the particulates, I mean, I'm really frightened, because how are you going to keep track of that? There's a big sign, you know, painted on a piece of plywood that says jobs with an arrow, and people are driving in, and they want money, and they know there's jobs, they're going to work, and then they're going to leave. And so how are we going to track that?
Where have you found the highest concentration of things that would be worrisome to people in terms of their environmental health?
Mostly in the sludge sediment, which is the water body sediments that have historically been contaminated by industrial discharges and runoff and illegal dumping. All of that sediment in those water bodies was transported onto the land and deposited all over, particularly in residential areas. And those residues contain polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, benzoate pyrene over the acceptable residential standard, semi-volatiles, volatiles, when that sedimenty sludge is still wet, the volatiles tend to evaporate when the sediment dries out. And then the heavy metals, arsenic and lead particularly exceeding the criteria, and then the whole host of other metals, including mercury, at levels below the criteria. So this sediment, if it was at a waste site that you were looking to clean it up and meet standards, would have to be removed and are treated. And yet the governing agencies are allowing the people to return home and wade through all this sludge, all this sediment, or the dust that is created, breathe the dust. And it's also highly contaminated with bacteria because of untreated sewer.
I think that of most paramount importance for me is the health of the people.
Okay.
You know, the physical and the emotional health. People are absolutely physically, spiritually, and emotionally exhausted. I was in my church and the priest called it disaster fatigue. People are overwhelmed, they're exhausted, they're misplaced, you know. So I would say certainly their safety is of utmost importance, that they're housed safely, that they have food, that they have shelter, that their children can go to school. They need medical help, medical assistance.
One of the health problems that Louisiana is going to be facing for a very long time is a problem of mental illness, and especially amongst the children. These children have been extraordinarily traumatized. They've been displaced. They've been put in a situation, some of them for more than a week at a time, some of them for weeks and now months at a time, where their whole environment is very unstable. They never know what's going to happen from day to day. They've been moved from shelter to shelter. Their parents now may be staying in a motel or a hotel, but they know they got to get out of there by February. Where are they going to go? Children shouldn't have to bear these burdens. And what is that doing to the mind of children? Not to mention the terror of going through a storm, not to mention the horrors of sitting in a dark Superdome. So we're already seeing behavioral problems in children.
What percentage of the people that you've spoken with do you think have little or no experience with or knowledge of exposure pathways and things like that?
I would say
complete faith in the government too. Yeah, I mean, so that
I would say the majority of the people don't really know. I'd say a majority. I'd say that the people who might have a small awareness don't want to believe that it would be possible, just like all of us. You know, if the government or my mayor is saying, I can come back in, surely it's okay. I think culturally, people feel so tied in the shrimping communities. They feel this need to get back, irregardless. And in one community, they said they just work until they're so sick they can't work anymore. And then they go back in and they work some more. So you have the sort of the theory, the academic, and then you have the reality. And I think you have to try to respect the culture and the people, and deal with the reality of what can you do to help those people.
Did you have any ideas of things you would like to do that would have a long-term running time, so to speak, and have goals that would be set in the future, as well as short-term objectives you wanted to accomplish?
Sure. One, an ongoing monitoring of the areas that are contaminated and what happens to the sludge and what happens to the bacteria and what happens to the mold. Linked to health tracking. The people who came back in and cleaned their own houses versus maybe people who had a contractor to clean their house, or people who had their houses bulldozed and they started all over again. Tracking the health impacts from those types of exposures over the long term. And I told you about the problems with doing that. But if we're going to learn anything from this, I think we have to focus it on the environment and health and figure out what the long-term impacts are to these communities. And I would pick a couple of pilot communities to do it.
I think it is important to get some very baseline studies. It's kind of hard to get baseline studies when the damage has already been done, but to get the best baseline studies you can before people move back to New Orleans. And then to carefully monitor their health over a period of years so that When problems are detected, they are detected early, and people have the best chance of getting a favorable outcome. Again, this is where people in those communities need to be very instrumental in designing those types of projects. Nobody wants to be a research project. Nobody wants to be stuck under the microscope. But if it is for your own good and you are getting information that you are going to benefit from, that kind of makes it a little bit different.
There's always varying levels of communication, it seems to me, with industry, and some of the older plant managers and people who don't believe, just sort of like the older government folks sometimes just don't, they're not used to a dialogue with folks like us. It's not part of what they do.
Would you like to get involved in a dialogue with them, though, about that? I mean, you know, in the spirit of moving forward as a community, not in any contentious way, just to check it out and make sure there wasn't any problem. And
we do that already. I mean, we have direct contact with industry already. So that would be a component that we'll be very comfortable with, because we're very aware that they're part of the community, and that we want them to be a good neighbor and be responsible, and, you know, have the right response, and people feel safe. So, I mean, we met in here with Exxon and Dow and Shintech and you name it. Come to the table right here. They come to this humble dwelling.
I think it's real obvious from, say, Katrina, that we need a much better system for helping our emergency response personnel and fire departments, police departments, emergency response agencies to understand how to deal with the one, getting people out of harm's way, which is called evacuation, and two, for people who, for whatever reason, are not going to get out of harm's way, how to protect themselves.
By just setting up some objective checks and balances, which is impossible, but you can at least try to get there, is going to help tremendously. Louisiana's been under the radar, and that's been unfortunate. Some of it's been political, some of it's been deliberate, you know. But this does provide an opportunity, if we can get the right leadership and the right funding in place, to build in independent monitors that do come, that are objective, and come back and measure the soil and test where they need to and ensure. Because all of that was broken before. There was no infrastructure for those things.
In visiting with our tribal members who have lost everything, a lot of them live along the bayou areas, and there's no longer a home standing. But yet when you speak to them with tears in their eyes, they talk about wanting to go home. And that's one thing they're speaking in a solid voice, is that they want to go home. And even though there's not a home left standing, it's because we have ties to our property. We have ties to the land. And it's not just a piece of property that we buy. It's not just a place that you live. We have a rich heritage in all of our different communities. And so they just speak in a solid voice of how they want to go home.
So I don't know exactly what NIEHS can do, because I don't know exactly what they've done in the past.
They've never done anything like this before at all.
I didn't think so.
No.
So there's no base of knowledge to draw on then, right? That's good and bad, isn't it? It's crisis and opportunity in the same character, right? So so you have an opportunity to serve.
People are just in a rough spot. Well, they don't know what to do. I mean, should they buy another house if they even can? Should they take insurance money and redo their house in the middle of all of this?
It's going to take a lot of patience and a lot of understanding to help us all get through this.
Cool. It takes about 20 seconds.
Here's a shrimper, pretty courageous little shrimper, who said, hey, I've got to go do it. So they pack up. Sometimes families, they may not be able to afford to have help anymore, so their wives and kids will jump on the boat and travel out. Now for me, being 57 years old, when I first went to school, when I was in elementary school, we had kids who only came to school a certain amount of days a year. The boys would go trapping in the winter with their dads.
and they would go trawling in the summer. So they'd have to take, either they'd quit school early, or they would get out of those months of school. That guy's putting crab traps out, trying to eke out a little living here. So now what's happening is people are not going to the shrimp sheds because they're non-existent, so they try to sell the shrimp from their boats. Now this place was seriously damaged, very, very damaged. And the rubble that I saw here 3 weeks ago is incredible. I'm going to pull off right here. The rubble that I saw here was incredible. This was a huge, huge marina, a beautiful marina, with lots of places for fishermen, but no more. Yeah, this is it right here. This is Dogonese. Every one of these little piling things was a house. Every one was a home. People lived there, totally gone. And it wasn't just Katrina, because you can see the marshland was gone. So they just lived in their little pilings here. But it is gone. And the only thing that's left is that one camp to the left and one camp to the right, or a couple of camps. But this was a little settlement, I think, of Dogonese. We're going to pass this little community. In fact, to the left, eventually, in fact, we can kind of start looking to the left. You're going to see a ruin of houses. And if you look to your left pretty much now, there was a road. Just slow down, there's no traffic. There was a road here. And there were houses here. And there were families that lived here. Now these people, these weren't camps. These are people who lived here all year round. And that's all that's left of their life. And look to the right, this guy's just like trying to rebuild right there. He's trying to rebuild. I'm gonna stop right here. Yeah. I hope this is still good. I don't hope it is. I hope it's not actually, but I think it is. Why are you rebuilding here?
Because this is where I like to live, and this is where we've been all our life. Wouldn't think of no other way. My grandma used to tell me, so when you get the big storm, you just pick your head up and you move on. And I guess you call this one the big one. I ain't never seen nothing like it. But I've been living out here all my life. My daddy lived out all his life. Even my grandpa lived out here.
You believe that says we're in a cycle where we're going to get all these big bad ones now?
I don't think we're going to get that. I think they might have another one hit somewhere, but I don't think we're going to get it. I hope we don't anyway. One's enough for us. We might not have got too many storms in the last few years, but in the last month we got 2 major storms. Them in the record books, them 2 storms. Florida got 4 hurricanes. They ain't got 2 like that.
Yeah.
Lord, 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 I'm so blue. My house got washed away, and I'm crying how long for another payday. That's why I'm crying, Mississippi heavy water blues. I'm sitting here looking at all of this mud, and my gal got washed away in that Mississippi flood. That's why I'm crying, Mississippi heavy water blues. Lord, 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 Mississippi shaking, Louisiana sinking, the whole town's a ranking. Robert Hicks is singing, that's why I'm crying, Mississippi heavy water blues.